Good evening. Welcome to Calm Past. In this episode, we'll drift gently into one of the most iconic moments in modern history. Though not through the grand staircases or polished brass of the first-class salons. No, tonight we'll board the RMS Titanic from a quieter, humbler angle through the clatter of third-class corridors, the rattle of bunk beds, and the soft hum of engines below the decks. This is not the version filled with orchestral drama or sweeping cinematic scenes. It's the slow, steady rhythm of real life aboard a floating city in 1912, a place of hope, fatigue, motion, and silence. We'll begin this journey far below the shining decks, where immigrants and working-class families huddled in modest cabins, unaware that they were part of something that would soon become legend. Then, we'll follow threads of personal stories, mysteries, and cultural contrasts revealing hidden passengers, puzzling relics, and what it meant to eat, sleep, and exist aboard the Titanic depending on who you were and what you paid. As always, I invite you to relax your body, soften your breathing, and let your mind drift like a gentle ocean current. You needn't follow every detail. The rhythm of history will carry you. And if you happen to fall asleep along the way, well, that's perfectly fine. Let's begin. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow gangway, the wood creaking faintly beneath your boots. It's cold, and the wind from the docks carries a briny chill. Around you are strangers, some carrying sacks or bundles tied with cord, others clutching children or glancing back one last time at the shoreline. You're boarding a ship bound for America, though all you've seen of it so far are the colossal sides of dark, riveted steel towering above you. Once inside, the atmosphere shifts. The gangway closes behind you. Now, it's the Titanic that surrounds you. And although you are on what was then the most luxurious passenger ship ever built, your experience here in third class is different from the grand images printed in the newspapers. The air in third class is filled with the faint, warm smell of coal exhaust and new paint, mingling with damp clothing and metal piping. It's not unpleasant, just lived in. The corridors are long, plain, and narrow, with white walls and simple signs. Electric lights buzz softly overhead, casting a pale, steady glow. You notice how clean it is, surprisingly clean. Whitewashed, scrubbed, orderly. The White Star Line took pride in maintaining a certain standard, even here below deck. You're led to your berth, what they call the sleeping space. It's a small room shared with several other passengers. The bunk beds are built into the wall, made of polished metal frames with thin mattresses. Each bed has its own neatly folded wool blanket and pillow. There's not much else, perhaps a single stool or a wash basin bolted into a corner. You stow your things under the bed or hang them on the single hook near the door. The walls are thin, and you can hear muffled voices in several languages: Irish, Swedish, Italian blending into a low, constant murmur. Children are already running up and down the hallway, laughing, their footsteps echoing like soft drum beats. There's no private bathroom, of course. Shared lavatories are down the hall, clean but stark, cold running water. No hot. You'll wash your face in the morning with a splash of it, wincing at the temperature, but grateful for it all the same. The toilets are fitted with metal flush mechanisms, surprisingly modern for the time, though the smell of soap and bleach lingers heavily in the air. Your meals are provided, though modest. Breakfast might be porridge and bread with marmalade, served in a plain dining room that's bright and bustling. Lunch could include a simple stew or boiled beef with potatoes. The plates are heavy, the utensils durable. You sit on a bench at a long table and eat shoulder to shoulder with strangers who, like you, are quietly hopeful. There are no chandeliers here, no orchestras or plush carpets, but there is warmth. Coal-powered radiators hum softly in the walls, and for many aboard, this space, however humble, is a considerable improvement from the homes they left behind. At night, the motion of the ship is gentle. You lie in your bunk, the metal humming faintly beneath you, the ship's engines providing a low, constant vibration like a lullaby made of iron. Outside your porthole, if you have one, the Atlantic stretches endlessly, moonlight reflecting faintly off the dark water. The Titanic is moving, and so are you. Forward, always forward, toward a new life. But down here in third class, you feel it differently. Not as an adventure, but as a transition. A liminal space between one chapter and the next. And tonight, here in this imagined memory, you are allowed to rest. Beneath a thin wool blanket, beside strangers, under the endless hum of ocean and steel. You're not expected to do anything, but drift. Let's now step away from the hum of third class and move quietly up the decks, not to luxury, not yet, but to find a man whose story rests somewhere between duty and tragedy. His name was Thomas Andrews, not a celebrity in his own time, not a captain, not a tycoon, just a shipbuilder. And yet, he would be remembered as one of the calmest, kindest, and most quietly heroic figures aboard the Titanic. Born in Comer, Northern Ireland in 1873, Thomas was raised in a world of design, craft, and quiet confidence. His uncle owned Harland and Wolff, the Belfast shipbuilding company that would one day construct the Titanic. And from a young age, Thomas, polite, tall, thoughtful, was drawn not to profit, but to precision. By his 20s, he had studied engineering. He was known in the shipyard not as a loud or commanding figure, but as one who listened to the riveters, the carpenters, the welders. He walked the yards with a notebook, asking questions, watching, learning, and eventually leading. By 1907, the White Star Line had plans to build 3 great ships, the Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, massive, elegant, unprecedented in scale. And Thomas Andrews was selected as chief designer. He oversaw every detail, not just of construction, but of how life aboard the ship would feel. From the placement of lifeboats to the design of the grand staircase, from the mechanics of the watertight doors to the curve of each corridor, he shaped the Titanic into what it became. But Thomas wasn't just a man of blueprints. When the Titanic set sail in April 1912, he boarded with her, not as a passenger, but as what was known as the Guarantee Group, a small team of Harland and Wolff men tasked with monitoring the ship's systems, ensuring everything worked and noting improvements for future builds. He was seen walking the decks each day with a clipboard in hand, making recommendations, checking notes, speaking with crew members, quietly visible, calmly present. And then on the night of April 14th, the calm turned to confusion. At 11:40 p.m., the ship struck an iceberg, a faint jolt. A noise described by some passengers as a soft tearing sound. Not dramatic. But Thomas knew immediately that something was wrong. He didn't panic. He assessed. Quickly, he descended into the bowels of the ship, examined the flooding compartments, and reportedly said to Captain Smith, "Ladies must get on board the lifeboats at once. There is not an hour to lose. You cannot pick and choose. get all you can aboard. If you value your lives, get what you can in the way of clothes and come on deck." Then he began moving through the corridors, calmly urging people to dress warmly and go topside. He knocked on cabin doors, handed out life jackets, helped load lifeboats, gave away his own gloves, told crewmen how to work the lifeboat mechanisms when many were confused. He refused to get in a lifeboat himself. Not once. There are reports that he was last seen in the first-class smoking room, alone, staring at a painting of a peaceful countryside. Others say he was seen on deck, throwing deck chairs into the ocean to help those already in the water, or that he was seen helping women and children until the very last moments. We can't know precisely. The accounts vary, and the truth has become softened by memory and myth. What we do know is that he died aboard the ship he built, and he did so without panic, without drama, and without complaint. He was 39 years old. After the disaster, survivors spoke glowingly of him, not as a hero in a dramatic sense, but as a person whose calm steadiness made others braver, who acted from instinct and from care, not command. He left behind no memoirs, no last letters, just the accounts of those he helped and a reputation for kindness under pressure. In Belfast, a plaque remembers him with the words, "He remained on board, and the testimony of survivors is unanimous that he devoted himself heroically to the safety of passengers, encouraging and directing them to the last." Tonight, his story is just a quiet part of the ocean's long memory, simple, steady, and still. In the days after the Titanic sank, the cold North Atlantic gave up its dead reluctantly, but some were found. A small Canadian ship, the CS Mackay Bennett, was dispatched from Halifax, Nova Scotia, to recover bodies. It arrived at the wreck site on April 20th, 1912, nearly a week after the sinking. What they found were lifeless figures floating in the sea, many still wearing life jackets. Others were beyond recognition. Some were gently removed, documented, and returned to land. Others, due to limited space and decay, were buried at sea. But among the bodies retrieved, there was one that captured the attention of all who saw him. A small boy, no older than 2 years, blonde hair, pale skin, clean socks, and little shoes. He had no identification, no name stitched into his clothes, nothing to indicate who he was or where he had been headed. The crew aboard the Mackay Bennett were so moved that they paid out of pocket for a proper burial in Halifax. He was buried in the Fairview Lawn Cemetery, where over 100 Titanic victims now rest. A small gray granite headstone was placed at his grave. It read only, "Erected to the memory of an unknown child whose remains were recovered after the disaster to the Titanic." For decades, that was all anyone knew. Visitors came. Flowers were placed. The grave became one of the most visited Titanic memorials. Perhaps because in that single image, a lost child, people could feel the human cost of the tragedy more than any list of names or tonnage of metal. Speculation followed. Some believed he must have been from third class. Others thought he may have been the child of Scandinavian immigrants. In time, science joined the story. In 2001, the grave was briefly opened. DNA testing was done using bone and dental samples, as well as preserved shoes and clothing. At first, investigators believed the child was Ino Panula, a Finnish toddler traveling in third class with his mother and 4 brothers. All of them died in the sinking. It seemed to match age, description, family. But further testing in 2007 revealed an error. The mitochondrial DNA didn't match. Eventually, with better samples and advanced analysis, the unknown child was identified as Sidney Leslie Goodwin, a 19-month-old boy from England. He had been traveling with his parents and 5 older siblings, all in 3rd class, hoping to start a new life in upstate New York, where his father had found work at a power station. Every member of the Goodwin family died in the sinking. Not a single body from the rest of the family was ever identified. So there he remained for nearly a century, under the name Unknown, a quiet symbol of loss and tenderness. But now we know his name, Sidney. His story is still told slowly and softly. A baby born in 1910, caught in history's most famous maritime tragedy, lost in the sea, and remembered for the way he symbolized all the others who had no one left to speak their names. The child whose grave became a shrine. And in the end, perhaps it's fitting that Sidney's memory was protected by strangers, cared for by sailors, mourned by people he never met. A reminder that history is sometimes not about the powerful or the famous, but the small and the silent, whose stories rest in quiet corners, waiting to be uncovered. Now, let us gently rise from the stillness of 3rd class and step quietly into another world. A different staircase, a different silence. Up here, everything feels more deliberate. The air is faintly perfumed with polish, tobacco, and fine wool. The noise of machinery is gone. The lights are softer, warmer. You don't see rivets or pipes. You see carved wood, etched glass, and thick carpets underfoot. This is 1st class aboard the Titanic. Here, the most expensive suite cost £870, roughly $100,000 USD in today's currency. That sum gave you access to a series of rooms, bedrooms, private sitting rooms, even a private promenade deck. But even more than square footage, it bought you peace, space, service. If you had the means, you didn't carry your luggage. You didn't wait in line. You were escorted aboard, offered a drink, and shown to your quarters by a steward trained in discretion. The walls of the suites were paneled in rich woods, mahogany, satinwood, oak, and styled in the latest fashions, Louis XVI, Georgian, or Empire Revival, depending on the room. Ornamental fireplaces glowed with electric heaters. Velvet upholstery and damask curtains muted the echo of footsteps. A bell system summoned a steward with the press of a button. Meals could be taken in your room or in the opulent 1st class dining saloon, which could seat over 500 passengers beneath elaborate crystal chandeliers and hand-carved columns. Your bathroom was private, with hot water on tap, an uncommon luxury in 1912. White porcelain fixtures gleamed under the gaslight-style electric sconces. Thick towels, soaps, and perfumed powders were provided daily. Each night, your steward would turn down the bed, fold your clothes, brush your shoes, and leave a program for the next day's events. Events that might include a visit to the Turkish bath with its marble steam rooms and masseurs, a reading in the 1st class library filled with upholstered chairs and books bound in calfskin, a promenade along the boat deck where you could walk laps around the ship's uppermost corridor, sheltered by the sleek white metal of Titanic structure. The experience was designed to replicate the finest London or New York hotels, but afloat. And yet, even here, beneath the elegance, there was a quiet tension. Not every 1st class passenger was noble. Some were new money, loud Americans with industrial fortunes. Others were old aristocracy, quietly looking down their noses at the noise. Tables were assigned by social hierarchy. Chairs had no wheels, so servants had to slide them out. Men wore tuxedos. Women changed clothes multiple times per day. But above all, there was the sense of separation. First-class passengers had their own staircase, their own elevators, their own lounges and cafes. Most never saw the people in steerage. And if they did, it was in passing, like seeing a reflection you weren't supposed to acknowledge. Yet when the iceberg struck, none of that mattered. When water began creeping upward, it moved indifferently through all classes. It soaked velvet chairs just as it soaked straw mattresses. It seeped into luxury as easily as into poverty. Still, in the hours that followed, first-class passengers were given priority access to the lifeboats. They were located closer to the top deck. Their stewards knew what to do. And so, many of them survived, though not all. Some chose to stay behind. Some believed the ship too grand to sink. Some refused to leave without their dogs, or their husbands, or their pride. One woman, Ida Strauss, refused a lifeboat unless her elderly husband could join her. They sat on deck chairs together and vanished beneath the sea. Another, Benjamin Guggenheim, dressed in full evening wear and told a steward, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." So this world of elegance, this quiet, candlelit dream of class and control, did not last. And tonight, we remember it not for its glamour, but for its stillness. For the silence of hallways where no footsteps pass anymore. For silverware that was never put away. For slippers left under beds that no one made again. The first-class suite was a sanctuary. But even sanctuaries are not immune to the ocean. As we drift downward once more, past the polished decks of first class, past the brass railings and paneled salons, we come to a place few passengers ever saw and even fewer thought about. The laundry rooms, deep within the Titanic's lower decks. Just above the boiler rooms, but below the passenger accommodations, was a steaming, relentless heart of labor. Here, dozens of workers, mostly women, fought a constant battle against time, heat, and sweat-soaked linen. Titanic was a luxury ship, yes, but luxury came with laundry. Thousands of sheets, napkins, towels, and tablecloths had to be cleaned daily. Not to mention the personal garments of over 2,200 passengers and crew. First-class travelers expected their collars crisp, their gloves spotless, and their underthings freshly pressed every morning. Even second-class guests could request clean shirts and blouses mid-voyage. And someone had to make that happen. The Titanic's laundry room was equipped with huge mechanical washing drums, industrial wringers, mangles, steam presses, and drying closets. It was cutting edge for its time, but still exhausting, dangerous, and swelteringly hot. Imagine stepping into that room. The air is thick, dense with the smell of soap, steam, and perspiration. You hear the whir and clank of machines, the hiss of hot irons, the rush of pipes overhead. The ceiling is low. The lights flicker slightly from the vibration of the engines. Water runs constantly. Soaked garments slap against metal drums as they spin. White steam coils in the air like ghosts. You can barely speak over the noise. Conversations are brief, shouted over the rhythmic beat of machinery. Most of the workers here were young women, part of the ship's domestic crew. Their job titles were things like washerwoman, ironer, presser, mangle hand. They worked in shifts, sometimes 12 to 14 hours a day, surrounded by heat, pressure, and constant motion. The mangle, a large machine used to press sheets flat between two heavy rollers, was particularly dangerous. If a sleeve or apron string caught in the rollers, injuries could happen in seconds. There were no safety switches, no emergency brakes, just steam and strength. In this small, uncelebrated world below decks, there was no glamour, no music, no open sky, just laundry. Some workers fainted from the heat. Others burned themselves on exposed pipes or scalded their hands with boiling water. There was little airflow, no windows, and yet the linens came out spotless, starched, and neatly folded. Because they had to. It was a strange contrast. Above, guests sipped tea with rosewater-scented handkerchiefs. Below, someone was scraping coal dust off their sleeves with lye. On April 14th, the day of the collision, the laundry rooms had already processed hundreds of pounds of linens. Late into the evening, workers would have been folding, pressing, soaking, preparing for another day of invisible perfection. When the iceberg struck, water didn't immediately reach this part of the ship, but when it did, it moved fast. There are no known survivors from the laundry staff. Their names are largely forgotten in official records, buried beneath titles like steward or general service. But they were there, folding towels, loading presses, scrubbing out lipstick stains and wine spills that would never be remembered. And now, in this soft silence, we remember them not for what they cleaned, but for what they endured. Their world was one of quiet labor, intense heat, and the unseen foundation of floating luxury. Tonight, the steam has cleared, and the machines are quiet. Of all the details remembered from that long, cold night, none has echoed through time more gently or more hauntingly than the music. The image is powerful, a small group of musicians standing on deck, calmly playing while the ship sank around them. It's become almost mythic, but this story is true. And it begins not with drama, but with discipline and a contract. Titanic's musicians were not technically crew members. They were employed by a private agency C, W&FN Black, a music contracting firm in England that provided entertainment for passenger ships. 8 men were assigned to the Titanic, split between 2 groups, a saloon trio for second class, and a quintet that played for the first-class passengers in lounges, cafes, and the grand dining saloon. They boarded in Southampton, carrying their own instruments, a mix of violins, cello, piano, and bass along with crisp black uniforms. Their job was simple: play tasteful, soothing music during tea time, dinners, and social hours. You can almost hear it now. Soft waltzes, light classical arrangements, perhaps a polite rendering of "Oh, You Beautiful Doll." Music chosen not to stir emotion, but to maintain atmosphere, to suggest order, luxury, calm. Each performance was carefully timed and tastefully subdued. They played pieces by Strauss, Offenbach, Chopin, popular but dignified. It was music that smoothed out the creaks of the ship and silenced awkward conversations. Among them was Wallace Hartley, the violinist and bandleader, a quiet, well-respected man from Lancashire. He was 33 years old and newly engaged. When Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, the musicians were off duty. Some may have already been in bed, others still dressed. But within minutes, passengers later recalled, they gathered on the deck and began to play. There was no command to do so, no official order. They simply understood. Music, in a moment like that, could slow the rising panic. It could disguise the fear, muffle the chaos, and give people something familiar to hold on to. So they took up their instruments and began to play. It's not known exactly what they played first. Survivors mentioned light ragtime tunes at the start, perhaps to keep spirits high. But as the night wore on and the situation became clear, their music reportedly shifted to more solemn hymns. The most widely remembered is Nearer, My God, to Thee. Some survivors swore it was the last tune they heard as the ship tilted skyward. Others recalled different melodies. The truth doesn't matter so much as the effect. Amid the lifeboats lowering, the cries in the dark, the groan of a wounded ship slipping into black water, there was music. Fragile, human, ordinary. 8 men playing not for applause, but for peace. None of the musicians survived. Wallace Hartley's body was recovered weeks later by the Mackay Bennett. He was found still in full dress, with his music case strapped to his body. Over 30,000 people attended his funeral in Colne, England. A violin believed to be his was discovered nearly a century later, water damaged but intact, and later authenticated. Its surface bore the inscription, "For Wallace, on the occasion of our engagement, Maria." The Titanic's musicians have become more than a footnote. They represent something enduring, calm in the face of chaos, duty without expectation, grace without spotlight. They played not because they had to, but because, in the end, they knew it would help. So tonight, let the memory of those soft, steady notes drift through your mind like waves on quiet water. No crescendo, no finale. Just music, dissolving slowly into the dark. Before the chandeliers, before the orchestra, before even the iceberg, there was Belfast. It was here, in the early 1900s, that a rising industrial city with soot-streaked skies and hammering shipyards took on a challenge unlike any it had seen before. The creation of the largest moving object ever built by human hands. Titanic was not born in elegance. She was born in iron, noise, and fire. The ship was constructed by Harland and Wolff, a vast shipbuilding firm occupying more than 80 acres along the River Lagan. By the time construction began in March 1909, the yard employed over 15,000 workers, men and boys, whose names never made it into history books. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't pose for photos, but they built Titanic. The workers came from all over, Catholic and Protestant, old trade families and new apprentices. Most were paid by the hour. Their workday began early, often before sunrise, and ended only when the foreman rang the closing bell. Picture it. The clang of metal on metal. The smell of burning pitch, sweat, and coal smoke. Towering gantries stretched high into the fog, casting shadows over heaps of rivets and coils of cable. The Titanic's twin hulls, she and her sister ship Olympic, were built side by side, rose slowly, frame by frame, from the shipyard floor like giant steel skeletons. To work on Titanic meant climbing, balancing, enduring. Riveters hung from scaffolding with leather belts, hammering red-hot iron rivets into place at a rhythm that never stopped. For hours each day, the sound of hammer strikes echoed across the harbor like the ticking of an enormous clock. The conditions were dangerous. Workers operated with minimal safety equipment. Falls were common. Burns, broken bones, or crushed limbs happened far too often. The great irony is that while Titanic was hailed as unsinkable, the building of her was far from safe. Boys as young as 14 or 15 worked in the yard, fetching tools, cleaning, or apprenticing with older craftsmen. They ran between steel beams and watched as whole sections of hull were lowered into place by massive cranes. For months, then years, these workers shaped thousands of tons of steel over 3 million rivets, 10,000 light fixtures, and nearly 2,000 portholes. They fit together each plate, each pipe, each stair rail. And when she was finally ready, they watched her slide down the slipway into the river on May 31st, 1911, cheered by crowds as if she were royalty. But most of them never sailed aboard her. In fact, for many of the men who built Titanic, she was already old news by 1912. They had moved on to the next job, another hull, another ship. The names we remember, Ismay, Andrews, Smith, stood on the decks. But the men who had swung hammers in the Belfast cold, who had eaten lunches of bread and tea under unfinished bulkheads, who had lost fingers to rivet guns and slipped on frost-covered scaffolding, they did not. When Titanic sank, the tragedy echoed through Belfast like a thunderclap. Shops closed. Pubs fell silent. The flags at Harland and Wolff were lowered. There were no loud speeches, just the heavy realization that something they had built with pride had now slipped beneath the sea, taking with it the lives of people they'd never meet. They had given it strength, but they had not been asked if it had enough lifeboats. Tonight, we remember them not as nameless hands, but as craftsmen and workers who built a legend with bruised knuckles and quiet resolve. Their tools are silent now. Their yards are mostly gone. But in every steel beam that rests at the bottom of the Atlantic, their work endures. Let us now return to something quieter, something deeply human: sleep. Aboard the Titanic, every day had its rhythms. Meals, walks, music, conversation. But eventually, even on a ship of such size and spectacle, the night arrived. And with it came a simple question shared by all 2,200 people on board. Where do I sleep? And what will it feel like drifting off in the middle of the ocean? Let's start at the bottom and work our way up. Third-class sleep. For those in third-class immigrants, workers, large families' sleeping arrangements were basic, but cleaner and more comfortable than many had ever known on land. Cabins were small, shared, and separated by sex or family group. Most had iron bunk beds, stacked 2 or 3 high, with a single thin mattress, a pillow, and a folded gray wool blanket. There were no nightstands, no windows unless you were lucky. The lighting came from small electric bulbs on the ceiling, which dimmed in the evening but never turned completely off. The air was warm, circulating from the ship's enormous heating system powered by the same boilers driving it through the Atlantic. The soundtrack to your slumber? The gentle creak of metal walls, the constant vibration of the engines, muffled footsteps in the corridor, the whisper of waves against the hull. Families slept close together, often fully clothed. There were no private bathrooms, just shared lavatories at the end of the hall. Still, for many, it was a good night's sleep. Better, in fact, than what they had left behind. Second-class sleep. Second-class passengers had private cabins, often shared only with one other person. The beds were simple but sturdy, with better mattresses, more pillows, and access to shared bathrooms that included hot water, a rare luxury in 1912. Before bed, a steward might bring you tea or hot water for washing. You could hang your clothes in a small wardrobe. The walls were paneled in polished wood. Your cabin might have a tiny desk, a mirror, and shelves with novels from the ship's library. Even the bedding felt softer starched white sheets, clean blankets, and a little more space to breathe. The gentle rock of the sea helped many passengers drift off without difficulty. First-class sleep, and now at the top first class. Here, night was a ritual. Beds were full-sized, with carved headboards, embroidered linen, and soft feather pillows. Some suites had adjoining sitting rooms, dressing rooms, and even private bathrooms with bathtubs. You could close thick velvet curtains and shut out the ship entirely. Your steward would turn down the bed, place slippers by your feet, and collect your laundry if requested. You might sip a glass of sherry or cocoa before changing into a dressing gown and settling in. Electric bedside lamps glowed warmly. If you left your porthole open, you might hear the wind moving past, a soft reminder of the vastness outside. For the wealthiest passengers, even the details of sleep were curated. They brought traveling trunks filled with silk pajamas, embroidered pillowcases, and monogrammed robes. But for all that luxury, sleep remained sleep, an act of surrender. Adrift into the unknown, surrounded by strangers, moving across a black sea. The night before, April 14th, was a calm, quiet night. The sea was unusually still, so still. Some passengers remarked it was unnerving. The sky was clear. Stars sparkled in the dark like powdered sugar on velvet. And as midnight approached, most passengers had gone to bed. They turned off the lights, settled under warm covers, and let the quiet motion of the ship lull them into dreams. None of them knew what would happen just minutes later. None of them expected the cold to reach their feet, or the corridors to flood, or the alarm to ring. But in those final moments before impact, Titanic was a floating hotel of soft breathing, rustling sheets, and half-formed dreams. And tonight, as we imagine ourselves aboard, we pause here in this moment, where all is still, where the ship is whole, where the engines hum like a lullaby and the blankets are warm. Let your own eyes close gently now. There is more to come. But for now, just rest. It is one of the quietest tragedies of the Titanic, not the sinking itself, but who was allowed to leave and who was left behind. The ship carried 20 lifeboats, enough for roughly 1,178 people on a ship, carrying over 2,200, and even that number was above regulations at the time. Lifeboats were not designed to save everyone. They were meant to shuttle survivors to rescue ships in case of a nearby accident. The assumption was always that the ship itself would stay afloat. Titanic was believed to be practically unsinkable, and so the shortage of lifeboats was never questioned. But when the ship struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., everything changed. Let's explore how class and location affected who made it out and who didn't. First class, passengers, proximity, and privilege. First-class passengers have the greatest access to lifeboats. Their cabins were located on the upper decks, closest to the boat deck where the lifeboats were stored. When the call came to assemble, stewards quietly moved through first-class corridors, knocking on doors, helping women into coats and boots, guiding them to staircases. They had time. They had help, and they were believed. In total, about 62% of first-class passengers survived. For women and children, the rate was even higher, more than 90%. But for men, the numbers dropped. Some stepped aside by choice, others were not permitted on. Second-class passengers, orderly but forgotten second-class passengers were located midship, a deck or two below. Their stewards also received orders to evacuate, but the information was often delayed or confusing. Some passengers waited too long, others weren't told at all. They made their way up staircases, passing through corridors that seemed unchanged. The ship didn't appear in distress, no sirens, no panic. By the time many second-class passengers reached the boat deck, lifeboats were already being lowered. Some were turned away. About 42% of second-class passengers survived. Again, women and children fared better, but confusion and lack of clear instruction led many to miss their chance. Third-class passengers, trapped by design, the third-class experience was different and devastating. Most were deep in the ship, on the lower decks, far from the boats, and they didn't speak English. Many were immigrants, Irish, Swedish, Lebanese, Italian, traveling with children and elders. To prevent mingling of classes, Titanic's design included physical barriers, locked gates, and metal doors that separated third-class corridors from the rest of the ship. Though some were opened eventually, many third-class passengers were delayed or blocked in their efforts to escape. Worse still, there was no steward knocking on their door. No clear instruction. Just the vibration of the ship and the growing murmur of worry. By the time they reached the upper decks, the lifeboats were nearly gone. Only 25% of third-class passengers survived. For men, it was just 13%. Crew members, the forgotten majority. There were more than 900 crew members aboard Titanic. Most of them were below-deck engineers, firemen, stewards, laundry workers, cooks. They worked the longest hours, earned the least pay, and had the lowest survival rate. Engineers, in particular, stayed at their posts as water rushed in, keeping the lights burning, the pumps running, and the communications online. Not one of the 35 engineers survived. Some stewards guided passengers to boats and then stepped back. Others died trying to break down locked gates. Only about 23% of the crew survived. Lifeboat mismanagement, half-empty boats. Perhaps the most haunting detail of all, many lifeboats were launched less than half full. Boat No. 1, meant for 40, was launched with just 12 people aboard, most of them from first class. Other boats floated away with 20 or 30 passengers, while hundreds remained on deck. There was confusion, panic, a refusal to believe the ship would actually sink. And so, hundreds were left behind, even when space remained. A quiet disparity. In the end, 1,500 people died in the icy Atlantic. And though the sea made no distinction between rich and poor, the numbers tell a different story. You were more likely to survive if you had money, access, language, a steward who knew your name, and you were less likely if you lived below, out of sight, with no one to guide you. Titanic was not just a ship. It was a floating symbol of the world as it was in 1912, divided by class, language, and privilege. Tonight we sit quietly with that truth, not in anger, not in judgment, just in memory. Let the silence speak for those who were never given the chance to rise. Long before Titanic struck her fatal obstacle, ice had already been haunting the North Atlantic. It was early spring April, the season when massive chunks of ancient glacial ice broke free from Greenland's coast and began a slow, ghostly drift southward. This path, known to mariners as Iceberg Alley, was not unusual. In fact, ice sightings were expected this time of year. But in 1912, the ice came farther south than usual and in greater numbers. Let's step back and examine what Titanic sailed into, not just a single berg, but a corridor of cold, dotted with silent sentinels that had been floating for months, some even years. What is an iceberg really? To the eye, an iceberg appears like a white mountain rising out of the sea. But in truth, 90% of its mass is underwater, hidden in the dark. Some icebergs were the size of houses, others the size of small cities. They were formed from compacted snow that fell tens of thousands of years ago, locked into glaciers and slowly pushed to sea by the force of time itself. When they broke off capped, they became icebergs, drifting aimlessly on ocean currents, melting slowly, day by day. The one Titanic struck was estimated to weigh over 100,000 tons. Warnings ignored or delayed. On April 14, 1912, Titanic received at least 6 separate iceberg warnings from other ships in the area. Wireless operators aboard ships like the Californian, the Mesaba, and the Coronia sent alerts. Ice reported in latitudes ahead. Large field ice and icebergs sighted. But Titanic's wireless system was overloaded, not with safety messages, but with passenger telegrams. The 2 Marconi operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were working nonstop to send personal messages on behalf of first-class passengers. Some warnings were received and acknowledged, others were missed entirely. One crucial message from the Mesaba was never delivered to the bridge. By the evening, the crew knew ice was in the area, but visibility was clear, and the sea was calm. In fact, the lack of wind made spotting icebergs harder. No waves broke around their bases. They were nearly invisible, and Titanic, despite warnings, continued at almost full speed, about 22.5 knots or 26 miles per hour. The night of the collision. At 11:39 p.m., lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, perched high in the crow's nest, spotted a shape ahead, dark, towering, still. Fleet rang the 3-bell warning and picked up the phone to the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. First Officer Murdoch ordered hard as starboard and engines reversed, but it was too late. The ship brushed the iceberg on her starboard side. It scraped along the hull, tearing open compartments below the waterline. No dramatic hole, just a long, jagged series of punctures, enough to flood multiple sections at once. And with that, Titanic's fate was sealed. The nature of the threat, what made the iceberg so dangerous, wasn't its size, but its silence. It didn't crash into Titanic. It didn't roar or splinter. It simply slid alongside her, tearing where it could, remaining still where it couldn't. It was indifferent, not malicious, not vengeful, just cold, floating, ancient ice, formed thousands of years before anyone on Titanic was born. Why didn't they slow down? This question lingers. Why did Titanic continue at such speed through known ice territory? The answer is partly cultural. At the time, ships routinely sailed quickly through iceberg zones. There was a belief, arrogant, perhaps, that modern steel hulls could withstand anything. Ice warnings were common, and captains were under pressure to maintain schedules and set records. Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, was planning to retire after this voyage. He was highly respected and experienced, but the idea of slowing down for ice, especially in clear weather, may have seemed unnecessary or even timid. By the time the crew realized the seriousness of the collision, the sea had already begun slipping through Titanic's arteries. Icebergs today. Even now, over a century later, icebergs still drift through these waters. But after Titanic, international laws were changed. The International Ice Patrol was established in 1914 to monitor iceberg movements, and ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for all passengers. That ancient ice, in a way, changed everything. And tonight, if you listen closely in your mind, you can almost hear the low creak of ice in the darkness, still, cold, unbothered, a reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers are not the loudest, but the ones floating silently in the dark. She has become one of the most enduring names from the Titanic disaster, the unsinkable Molly Brown. A woman of action, defiance, and a sharp tongue, she's often portrayed as the loud, brassy heroine who grabbed an oar, rallied frightened passengers, and stood up to the crew. But who was she really? Let's gently part the curtain between legend and life, and meet the woman behind the nickname. Her real name wasn't Molly First, a small truth. Her name was Margaret. Margaret Tobin Brown. She was born in 1867 in Hannibal, Missouri, to Irish immigrant parents. Her family was poor, and she worked from a young age in a factory. At age 19, she married James Joseph J.J. Brown, a mining engineer. The two moved to Colorado and struck it rich when J.J. discovered a vein of gold. Margaret Brown suddenly found herself wealthy, but not content to simply enjoy it. She took up philanthropy, supported labor rights, learned several languages, traveled extensively, and moved with ease between elite circles and working-class communities. She was never fully accepted by the old money elite. Her wealth was new, and her manners too bold. But she didn't care. She was herself entirely. A last-minute ticket in early 1912, Margaret was in France. She received word that her grandson was ill, and immediately booked the first available passage back to America, which happened to be on the Titanic. She boarded at Cherbourg alone, carrying a first-class ticket. During the voyage, she made friends quickly. She was fluent in French, German, and Russian, and known to chat with both passengers and crew. She dined with wealthy industrialists, but also visited third class, donating money and offering help to immigrant women. The night of the sinking, when Titanic struck the iceberg, Margaret was already in bed. She later recalled being thrown slightly forward in her cabin. A steward came to check on her. She dressed quickly, not in a panic, but with care layering clothing against the cold, grabbing money, and heading to the upper decks. She was eventually helped into lifeboat No. 6 against her will, she later said. Once afloat, she became a source of stability. She urged the frightened women to row, to keep warm, to stay focused. She argued with the boat's crewman, Quartermaster Robert Hickens, who refused to return to help people still in the water. "I'll throw you overboard," she is rumored to have said, "if you don't shut that hole in your face." It's hard to separate fact from flourish, but everyone agreed she kept order and boosted morale. After the rescue, when the Carpathia rescued survivors, Margaret sprang into action. She organized a survivors committee, raised money for second and third class passengers who had lost everything, and personally gave out blankets, food, and clothing. She wrote letters, lobbied for relief funds, and even confronted the press, insisting that survivors' voices, not just the wealthy, be heard. For the rest of her life, she refused to be remembered only for Titanic. She ran for Senate. She advocated for women's rights, education, and mine safety. She worked with wounded soldiers during World War I. She studied acting. She climbed pyramids in Egypt and explored the Balkans on foot. She lived loudly, deeply, and without apology. The nickname and the myth. It wasn't until after her death in 1932 that the name the unsinkable Molly Brown was popularized largely by plays and films that exaggerated her accent, manner, and attitude for comic effect. She likely never called herself Molly. Her friends knew her as Maggie or simply Mrs. Brown, but still, the nickname stuck. And it's not wrong. Because in a moment when many froze or faded into the background, Margaret Brown did what few others could. She spoke up. She acted. She endured. And when others sank into silence, she rode forward. So tonight we remember her not as a caricature in a feathered hat, but as a woman of depth and steel who lived her own truth and left behind a legacy not just of survival, but of purpose. Let her strength row beside you in the dark, quiet ocean of this story. Among the jewels, trunks, and dinner coats packed aboard the Titanic were dogs. Not many, but enough to remind us. The people on that ship were not just passengers, but pet owners. They brought with them the soft, loyal presence of animals' companions who neither knew nor cared that they were aboard the most luxurious ocean liner in the world. There were at least 12 dogs aboard Titanic, perhaps more. Most were small breeds, easier to accommodate in a ship's cabin. They included Pomeranians, Pekingese, Bulldogs, Airedales, and Toy Spaniels. Let us drift briefly now into this softer, quieter world, the world of Titanic's four-legged passengers. Pause in the corridors. First-class passengers had the freedom and space to bring pets. The ship even included a dedicated kennel on F-deck, tended to by a crew member whose sole job was to feed, walk, and care for the animals. There was a daily routine. Dogs were taken for walks on the upper decks in the early morning. They were fed and brushed. Some were visited by their owners regularly. Others remained in their onboard cages, accustomed to the journey. At least one dog believed to be a Great Dane was too large for the kennel and stayed in its owner's cabin. Some pets traveled under assumed names, not officially registered. Others had pedigrees, ribbons, and expensive collars. The owners and their pets, a few specific passengers and their dogs are remembered. Margaret Hayes, a young American woman, traveled with her Pomeranian, named BB. When the ship struck the iceberg, she wrapped BB in a blanket and carried her into a lifeboat. The dog survived. Henry Sleeper Harper, heir to the Harper and Brothers publishing fortune, brought along his Pekingese named Sun Yat-sen. He and his wife also escaped with their dog. Another Pomeranian, owned by Elizabeth Rothschild, survived as well hidden under a blanket as she entered a lifeboat. But the others did not. The left behind, most of the dogs were kept in the ship's kennels locked, unattended, and far below the lifeboats. When the ship struck the iceberg, their fate was sealed along with the lower decks. There were no plans to evacuate animals, no place for them in lifeboats. And yet, they were there waiting, breathing, listening. Some stories suggest that one of the dogs was freed from the kennels in the final moments, possibly by a crew member or a heartbroken owner. There were later reports of a dog swimming through the freezing water, howling. One passenger, Helen Bishop, lost her toy bulldog, Gammon de Pickham. She had refused to leave the ship without him, but was forced into a lifeboat by the crew. She wept as she watched the Titanic slip beneath the waves, knowing he was still aboard. Another, William Carter, brought his prized Airedale, Kitty. The dog was left behind in the rush to evacuate. Carter later filed an insurance claim for $300, about $9,000 in today's money. No claim, of course, could cover the grief. A small cemetery of memory. The Titanic's dogs are not often remembered. They left no journals, no quotes. But their absence was deeply felt by the people who loved them. And tonight, it's worth pausing to imagine them. A kennel rattling gently with motion. Tiny paws pacing behind metal bars. Dogs waiting at doors, tails thumping. And finally, stillness. Why it matters, these animals were part of the ship's life. They were loved. They were groomed and fed, shown off to other passengers, cradled in arms. They offer a human detail in a story so often told through steel, ice, and lifeboat statistics. They remind us that even in tragedy, there are smaller griefs, quieter heartbreaks that echo just as deeply. So tonight, let us remember them, the faithful, the overlooked, the companions who didn't understand, but stayed close until the end. When a great ship sinks, we often focus on the lives lost, the stories ended, the people never seen again. But when the Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic, it also left behind a million tiny echoes objects, belongings, keepsakes. Some sank with her, some floated briefly. Others remained, long buried in silence, until decades later they were retrieved from the wreck, like whispers rising from the deep. Let's gently examine these quiet artifacts, fragments of normal life, frozen in time. The luggage never unpacked Titanic was a voyage of hope, leisure, and transition. Passengers brought belongings to match their station in life. First-class travelers arrived with monogrammed trunks, filled with evening gowns, pearl brushes, perfumes, silk shirts, and silver toiletry kits. Second-class passengers brought more practical wardrobes, books, and letters from relatives. Third-class families carried worn suitcases, crammed with every possession they owned. Heirlooms, holy books, seed packets, and shoes for the new world. None of them would unpack. At the bottom of the sea today lie over 5,000 pieces of luggage split, buckled, fossilized in rust and sand. Some of them still hold shoes, coins, spectacles, and the occasional child's toy. Clocks that kept ticking. Dozens of pocket watches and shipboard clocks were recovered from the wreck site, each one stopped at a slightly different time. Some froze when they hit the water. Others were wound tight until the moment they sank. One watch, found inside a leather case, had cracked glass and hands stuck at 2:28, just at minutes before the final plunger. These broken clocks are now preserved behind glass in museums, reminding us that even time itself could drown. Letters that were never sent in the mailroom. Titanic carried 3,364 mailbags and over 7 million pieces of post. Many were business letters. Others were postcards, some already written, ready to be mailed upon arrival in New York. In later years, divers discovered waterlogged envelopes still sealed, their ink smudged, names blurred but visible. One letter, addressed simply to Mother, was recovered intact. The paper had darkened, but the words remained legible. What did they say? Nothing dramatic. Just simple thoughts, updates, love, packed into sentences, now delivered too late. The musical instruments. Among the most poignant finds were instruments. A corroded violin believed to have belonged to bandleader Wallace Hartley was later found. The wood warped but still bearing the engraved initials of his fiancée. Tiny fragments of sheet music were also recovered, some unreadable, others still identifiable by key and time signature. They will never play again, but we can still hear them. Shoes without owners. Perhaps the most haunting objects recovered from the debris field were pairs of shoes, often found alone, lying in the silt, slightly apart, as if their owners had simply stepped out of them. Some were children's boots. Others were leather dress shoes, lace-ups, or slippers. Divers would sometimes find two shoes side by side, perfectly preserved by the cold, and realize they were likely all that remained of a person whose body had long since dissolved into the sea. The shoes stayed, quiet, anchored, waiting. Everyday things that tell a bigger story. Recovered from Titanic's resting place. A leather satchel with a razor, pipe, and spectacles. A gentleman's bowler hat. A perfume sample case. Its vials still faintly fragrant after 70 years under the sea. A child's marble toy, nestled in a coat pocket. A keys ring with tiny labels still attached. Mailroom. Pantry. Cold storage. Each item speaks without a voice. Each one belonged to someone. Why objects matter, we often think of history in dates and names. But the truth is, it also lives in buttons, in handwriting, in the feel of a worn coat, or the smell of a leather case. These things remind us that the people on Titanic were real, not just characters in a film or entries in a ledger. They packed their favorite shirts. They brought keepsakes. They carried bread rolls in their pockets. They remembered birthdays. And when they were gone, these small things remained. Tonight, as we sink slowly into stillness, imagine one such object resting on the ocean floor, undisturbed, untouched, but remembered now. A child's shoe, a letter to no one. A comb, a diary, a playing card. The sea kept them, but now, so do we. There are moments in history that grow quiet as they unfold, not with shouts or fire, but with long silences, broken only by the sound of water, wind, and breath. The final hours aboard Titanic were like this. Let us now walk slowly, calmly through those last moments above deck, where cold steel met colder night, and time began to stretch into something strange. The cold that crept in. After the collision at 11:40 p.m., there was no immediate sense of doom. Passengers, roused from sleep, dressed slowly, curious but unafraid. The ship had stopped moving. That alone was unusual. Outside, the night was clear, so clear, in fact, that stars sparkled without flicker. But the air was sharp, the temperature hovering around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to bite the fingertips, to fog the breath. Many stood on the decks without coats, in silk slippers or nightshirts, assuming they'd be back in bed soon. But the ship was already bleeding from below. The quiet confusion for the first hour, most people didn't believe they were in danger. Stewards offered tea. Some passengers returned to their cabins. Others waited politely by the railings. Titanic was too grand, too steady, too full of confidence to be vulnerable. Even after the order came to man the lifeboats, people hesitated. There were no sirens, no alarm, just quiet urgency. The crew moved quickly, speaking in low voices, trying to sound calm. The lifeboats lowered at 12:40 am. The first lifeboat was lowered. It was less than half full. Many passengers refused to board, thinking it safer to remain on the unsinkable ship than risk a small, bobbing craft in the middle of the sea. Lifeboat after lifeboat followed, some filled, some not. Officers began enforcing the rule. Women and children first. Husbands kissed their wives' hands. Children were passed over railings. Some men stepped back voluntarily. Others tried to slip in quietly. The deck lights still shone. The music continued. Titanic was sinking with grace. The band that played on, they played for nearly 2 hours. No one ordered them to. They simply gathered their instruments and began. Ragtime, hymns, like classics. It wasn't a concert. It was something else. A gesture. A gift. A spell to hold off panic. Passengers recalled hearing Autumn and Nearer, My God, to Thee. The melodies floated through the cold, over the creaking of the ship, into the stars, and then into silence. The lights begin to fade. By 2 a.m., only a handful of lifeboats remained. Hundreds were still aboard, many now aware that there was no escape. The bow had sunk far below the water. The angle of the deck grew steeper. The cold became unbearable. Some jumped. Others knelt to pray. Some stood quietly, arm in arm, facing the dark horizon. The engines stopped. The lights flickered, dimmed, and finally went out. Darkness swallowed the ship. And still she remained afloat, just barely. The final break at 2:18 a.m. Titanic broke in two. Eyewitnesses described the sound like metal snapping, like a tree being torn from the ground, like the earth itself splitting. The bow section plunged downward. The stern rose sharply, stood briefly upright against the sky, and then fell. The sea closed over her. By 2:20 a.m., the largest ship in the world was gone. Silence on the water. What followed was the quietest sound in history. 1,500 people in the water. Few screamed. Most were too cold. Life jackets kept them afloat, but the water was 28 degrees cold enough to kill in minutes. Lifeboats, just yards away, sat in stunned silence. Most did not return. Only one boat eventually came back. When it arrived, the water was still. The voices were gone. The sky above, there were no clouds that night. The moon was missing, but the stars were out bright, indifferent, unchanged. They looked down upon lifeboats bobbing like crumbs in an endless black sea, and on nothing at all where a ship had once stood. So now we sit with that stillness. We walk slowly from rail to lifeboat, from stateroom to life buoy, from orchestra to ocean. Let the night wrap around you like a wool blanket. Let the stars above Titanic be the stars above you now, silent, still, waiting. And now, at last, we reach the morning. Titanic is gone. The sea is still. The stars have faded. And in the frozen quiet of April 15th, 1912, 705 survivors drift in lifeboats, scattered across the Atlantic like fallen leaves on black glass. They are cold. Exhausted, many are barefoot. Some hold hands. Others rock silently, eyes open but seeing nothing. And then a distant light appears. Not the moon, not a star, but a ship. The Carpathia arrives at 4 Hermes. The RMS Carpathia, a Cunard line steamer, arrived on the scene. She had turned toward Titanic's distress call hours earlier, 58 miles away, when she first heard the signal. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, pushed the ship faster than it had ever sailed, dodging icebergs in the dark, racing into the unknown. When Carpathia reached the coordinates Titanic had set, there was nothing there. Only silence, only stars, only cold. And then the lifeboats began to appear in the distance, dim shapes, drifting on the horizon. Bringing them aboard, it took over 4 hours to gather all the boats. Ropes were lowered. Blankets unfurled. Stewards stood ready with hot drinks, dry clothes, and chairs. Some survivors had to be lifted bodily from the boats, too weak to climb. Others simply wept in silence, wrapped in coats that weren't their own. A few still clutched children. Some carried nothing at all. They were shocked, shivering, sunken-eyed, but alive. And as each lifeboat was brought aboard, the scale of the loss became clearer. 705 people saved. Over 1,500 still missing. No Titanic in sight. There was no debris field, not in the way many expected. Only a few deck chairs, some wooden planks, empty life rings, a floating hat, a child's doll. The sea had swallowed almost everything. It was as if Titanic had never existed, except for the people who had been carried away from her. News reaches the world. Carpathia turned back toward New York, carrying the survivors and the first whispers of what had happened. The wireless operator, Harold Cottam, transmitted the message. Titanic sunk. Over 1,500 lost. The news spread like a wave across continents. Families gathered in telegraph offices. Newspapers printed black banners. The world had never imagined a ship so large, so luxurious, so modern could simply vanish. A quiet arrival on April 18th, 3 days after the sinking, Carpathia reached New York. It was raining. Crowds waited at the pier. Reporters held notebooks. Family members held signs and photographs. Everyone stared at the ship's dark silhouette as it slowly pulled into harbor. When the survivors disembarked, they did so in silence. Some were met with tears and embraces. Others walked into emptiness, no one waiting for them. A few collapsed. Aftermath and memory, there would be inquiries, articles, memorials, and monuments. There would be films, songs, books, and eventually a wreck rediscovered, lying 2.5 miles beneath the surface. But for those who survived, Titanic never became myth. It remained a night they lived. A night of music, cold, and lifeboats. A night of loss. A night of quiet survival. A final thought tonight, as you lie still, eyes closed. Somewhere between waking and dreams, remember this. Survivors remembered not the sound of the iceberg, or even the sinking itself. They remembered the silence afterward. The way the stars hung motionless over the water. The way the sea, once so proud and glittering, became a dark cradle, holding them until dawn. And eventually, as the Carpathia pulled them from the cold and into the light, they remembered one more thing. They were not alone. The voyage is over. Let the waves still. Let the story settle. Close your eyes now and sleep.